Welcome to In the Particles, where we gather with our community to talk about the creative process and postmodern performance practices and explore a perhaps new art movement that we're calling particleism.
Hi.
Hello and welcome to In the Particles.
Welcome.
This is episode 10. And here we have Deborah Black.
I'm back.
Youlim
Hi.
and Sophia Trainer.
She's here.
I'm back.
She's back. She's out of the woods.
And today we are really interested in having a conversation that maybe I'll title An Experimenter's Bias Against the Canon.
Ooh. Juicy.
Ooh. And so we're going to be talking about the canon and our own biases and trying to unlock some of those, bring some of these things more conscious.
So should we start with what the canon is, or do you want to tell a little bit about how you came to this special episode?
Yeah, maybe I'll start with the personal and then we'll zoom out. So I'm in a graduate program. I'm doing my MFA right now, and it's my first semester and in theater directing at University of Victoria.
Sick.
It's
Watch out, world.
Watch out, everybody. It's on this beautiful island. You know, there's whales everywhere and mushrooms growing out of the ground everywhere. And I thought, oh my God, what a perfect place to go to develop my study on working on performing beyond human relationships. But of course, because it's an institutionalized program with a degree, I have to display that I have certain skills. And one of the things I had to display this semester was that I could successfully direct a production of Anton Chekhov's Uncle Vanya in the style of realism. Now, this is a style that I have studied as an actor, but pretty much have walked away from since I was in undergrad.
And you were trained in method acting, right?
Yeah, Stella Adler technique. Yeah, Stanislavski based. And so it was very interesting in many ways to go back to kind of my roots as an actor, and also to experience a profound resistance to working with a text that is known by many and an author that is known by many to have set a standard in the world of European and American theater. So really great opportunity to work outside my comfort zone, which is maybe usually, devising or talking to rocks, improvising, and working with new plays like Youlim's plays. And the whole process really got me thinking about, what was this resistance about that I had? Because I do feel when I went to reading this play, I was like, wow, no, the writing here speaks to me. It is fantastic. To me, the writing, I was shocked. It was fantastic. Absolutely. And I had seen past Chekhov productions that I didn't love, that felt very much about psychological conflict, like between people, where people were just mean to each other for 2 hours.
It's like soap operas, Chekhov.
Yes, yeah, kind of like that. But reading it, there was something else in it that I was feeling and sensing that hadn't was not represented in my relationship to it as an object in the canon. And I realized that so much of my resistance over of course I had an identity crisis in the middle of this and was like, is this going to change me forever? Well, hopefully everything we do does. But anyway, I had this realization that as someone who is really interested in experimentation and trying things that are outside the box and questioning hierarchies, smashing them, that working with a text that people have ordained as of the highest pedigree, that I felt like I was taking a precious antique off of a shelf and dusting it off and trying not to break it. And it was just going horribly. Like, the process was just running into the ground because I was being so careful and still had this conversation, this canonized conversation happening inside of my mind. Like, what is Chekhov play? Why is it important? What's the style? How do you... there's all of, at least in Stanislas, or at least Stella Adler, there's this idea that you raise yourself to the text. Right. That you elevate yourself to the text. And in some way, I think that's a beautiful idea. But all of this was blocking me from having a relationship with what, once I gave up on this way that I was working, I found that all of that was blocking a living, breathing relationship with the intelligence held within the material itself that could allow me to have an interpretation of this text that was not laden and heavy and dragging the chains of the good girl canon that was being stimulated in my mind and my heart.
What's good girl looking like to you?
Good girl.
What's that good girl?
The good girl is making something that'll make people feel happy or that they understand, and doing a good job at somebody else's expectations, fulfilling someone else's expectations. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
Making a gesture with her hands.
Deborah's waving arms into the air. Yes.
Looking up, like, why?
Yeah, so all
and
of
also, oh my god, I had that experience too this year.
And so then I got really curious about, okay, what has it done to art that we have canonized it? I brought this question to Deborah and Youlim. And Deborah has looked up a definition of canon.
Yes, so...
Not the printer canon.
Not the printer canon, and not the thing that bombs you.
No, not the bomb thrower. CANON.
Yeah, so I think it comes from Greek, which is of no surprise, right? As you were studying Aristotle for your master's degree.
Oh my
right?
god,
So
yes, that's another episode.
This built up epistemology is similar to...
Yes, it is.
everything in the West. So the first records of the term canon come from before the 900s. It ultimately comes from the Greek canon, meaning measuring rod or rule. Often canon can refer to a set of rules or a collection of works that dictate the rules. Rules that dictate rules.
Rules that dictate rules. Oh, this feels like a house of cards.
I mean, it's not so different than what we talked about with like Doris Humphrey's book with the right, wrong pictures.
That's right.
That there are rules for every art form that have been passed down, and a series of people that kind of break those rules and maybe create something new or groundbreaking, or like, oh my gosh, I didn't even know we could do that, because people were stuck in the rules for so long.
Yeah, exactly. And I think sometimes when I'm in the studio, like, not directing Uncle Vanya, but within my own practice, I can, because I have this great pride as an experimenter, I can find myself trying to avoid things that have been ruled, like, let's see, like speaking loudly and clearly, making sense, or even being beautiful, or, any kind of proven step, like a
Crotch grab.
A crotch grab.
Madonna did it. Michael Jackson did it. It must work.
It must
everyone.
work. I've proven steps. I have found myself actually really limited by my desire to avoid all of these things, like potholes, or like they're laden in the ground and going to jump up like snakes and snatch me down.
Yeah.
Which I feel is not a creative world of abundance. If I'm constantly trying to avoid these things that are known because I live in a culture that has canonized them. But yeah, go ahead.
I mean, just to say too that this from Oxford Classical Dictionary, Classical Greek, ruler standard, came from a manual on proportions by a sculptor, right? So that speaks to beauty, right? You're supposed to have this amount of space between your arms and your legs or whatever. And then the word was later applied by Christian writers to approve selections of books of the Bible. The word canon was not used in pagan antiquity, right? So we're also maybe speaking about something that is, very present now, of like what an indigenous or multi-pantheon of religion, right, like, might have done differently if we didn't have this, like, in Western culture, this, like, one God, one figure God. Kind of thing. Perfect model of dialect, somebody that represents the standard or genre or the model, right? So basically, in the Western canon, we're basically always put in relationship to those works, right? Like,
and those works that have been named as perfect.
Perfect, yes.
Of course, any culture is going to be in relationship to the art makers, the writers, the inventors, the engineers, the medicine people that have come before them, but to have an assumption that the work that has come before is perfect, and that perfection is the goal of making something, feels really deadly.
Yeah.
It feels like a complete deadly dead end to me.
Yeah.
So, I'm so curious, I guess, to think about how to be in relationship with these works that have come in the past, because I don't want to cut off the world that has come before me. How to be in relationship with them in a way that is active.
Well, what happened during your process? Were you able to, like, grapple with that, or do you feel like you just had to finish the assignment?
Well, one thing about Uncle Vanya that was very convenient for me and very interesting is that there is two things, actually, that I realized were at work in the play that gave me a way in. One is that there is a character in the play that is very concerned about the forests. The forests.
The doctor, yes.
Yes, Astrov is planting as many trees as he can because the Russian forests are wringing under the axe. And this was written in 1896. And so the presence of the earth and the fact that this is happening on a farm, and that so many of Chekhov's plays actually take place. We call them estates, but they are farms.
Yeah.
It is not the British aristocratic version of an estate. They're farm people who are often supporting their aristocratic city-dwelling cousins.
Right.
It's kind of like a domestic colonialism, actually. Like the countryside being extracted from in order for the highfalutin city, often like high culture artists or intellectuals to be producing.
That's so true.
Already kind of complex.
Yeah.
Yes, we're all sitting in New York City.
Like,
talking about ideas.
right. And then I'm like, oh my gosh. Yeah, this feels actually quite relevant and scary how much this particular writer is celebrated, and those ideas, I don't know, weren't enough of an intervention to save the Russian forests. I don't know. But also the other thing that I think was that I landed on was just feeling how there's another question inside of it, which is what is the point of being alive, really? And so when I found that question, I was like, well, I cannot contemplate this question with all of this baggage around me of the canon, my own personal canon baggage. Like it is definitely my own personal canon baggage in relationship to good girl version of Sophia. So I had to drop it and just look at how that question was moving throughout the writing, and then what was happening for the actors.
I have a question. Did you have to revisit method acting training to direct your actors?
I definitely called upon my own experience doing that kind of training to help them, and I did use Stanislavski-based technique in some way, but in other ways it wasn't the only thing. And I found once they could grapple with just like existing comfortably on stage with each other, speaking these words, that what I really needed from them was to feel like they could be far more foolish. There's this saying that because Russia didn't have their own the Renaissance in the same way that Europe did, with reason rising to the top of the hierarchy of like everything having a reason and being able to be explained, that the power of emotions is inside of Russian literature much more present because it's not necessarily thought of as lesser than intellectual thought.
Yeah.
So we did end up really utilizing a lot of physical and more viewpoints related emotional practices, as well as just like trying different styles, like rehearsing it as if it was an opera. Just trying to open things up.
I love that. I asked you this because Chekhov's plays are the reason why Stanislavski invented method acting, because without method acting training, Chekhov's plays really don't work. And I'm curious if, since you directed,
Ooh, a whole bag of words there.
yeah, I know. So
Yeah, this is really interesting.
that's
And
what I.
this is what this is. You're totally right, and it was really wild reading about how much Chekhov in so many instances did not like Stanislavski's direction of his work. So I think we receive these truths.
Exactly. That's what I learned at school.
Yes, and I think it is the way, and they have been paired together in a really beautiful way for a whole new theatrical form at the time.
It's a great invention.
It's a fantastic invention, and then I think we got stuck with this pair that is a very stimulating pair together, but in the sense that we've kept them on this pedestal.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting too to think of, right, the experimental artists being in maybe a direct protest or comment on that kind of way of working too. I mean, in dance, I remember when I was in my first year in my master's program, I had to make a solo, and one of the instructions we were given was to work differently than the way that we usually do. And since I work in a very sort of chance-based, intuitive place, I thought, like, well, what does that mean for me, right? Because to give that direction to me was very different than giving it to maybe one of my classmates who had only ever made a dance standing forward in a kind of formation with other dancers. And it was a class taught by Douglas Dunn and Randy Sloan, and both of them are experimental artists, so they were encouraging other people to work differently than what they were trained to do. But what did that mean for me? And I remember you said, like, oh, you end up doing what they, right? You end up doing something actually older. And as you were, so Sophia, when she was saying there were these two things, she was holding her hands up like, almost like yin-yang, kind, right? Like fingers kind of coming in towards one another. We are holding on to two things. And it's just thinking about, like, yeah, if there was actually more options, and maybe it's up to us as experimental artists to say, like, let's not I mean, maybe even having a label for it is a bad thing, actually, because then it puts it in that binary with that thing that came before, the canon, maybe, of those works. And so then it's like, if I can't do the experimental thing, then I guess I have to do this other thing, this canon, this historical perfection thing. But maybe not. Maybe there are more options. I don't know, just thinking about, like, how we think about our own work is maybe it gets like kind of flattened sometimes.
Totally. Exactly. Which I think is why I got really excited when you brought up personal canons.
Yeah.
And I think maybe for anyone listening out there, this so when Deborah was researching the canon, what is a canon, she brought up that, oh yes, and it's not just that there's a Western canon. Every single culture has their own canon, their own measuring stick, their own artists or thinkers or engineers or people that have set a standard of a way of doing something. And then the personal canon, so who is it that you are deeply influenced by, or whose work you in maybe some ways are trying to emulate, or there's an impact of their work that kind of continues on in your work. And I thought maybe I could just encourage you in this moment, if you're listening, to pause the recording here for 1 second, or not 1 second, but
minutes.
10 minutes, and write what your own canon is.
Yeah, what are those artworks that you admire and maybe are even actually not emulating, but maybe emulating, or have spent time even copying parts of, or have pulled them apart and, tried to figure out how the mechanics of them work, or, or even just inspired by certain aspects of them, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it can be a religious figure.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, spiritual teachers.
Oh, yeah, it doesn't even have to be theater. Yeah, it could be any number of things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, a TV show.
TV show, yeah. Maybe characters in movies.
Yeah.
And we were also talking about niche canons, like the canon, and maybe that would be something nice to do with a collaborative group that you're working in, or with a group of friends, or in a relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Like who is a part of our canon here inside of this this version of reality that we are constructing together and honoring, and that we want to grow.
Yeah. Okay, so pause the recording, and we'll see you in a few minutes. Okay. Welcome back. I hope that was useful. Just a couple of other things about canons. Canonization also happens in the Catholic Church. Church laws or decrees are also considered canons. So this word shows up in many different places. But actually, I wanted to ask Sophia now in retrospect. I know it's only like a few days or weeks retrospect from your semester. But did you think it was valuable to have to go through that grappling?
Yes, I did. It was something that there were many times when I asked, why am I doing this? What have I done? What am I doing? But the answer is definitely yes. It does feel like it was useful. And one of the biggest reasons that I feel that it was useful is because having to grapple with this thing in the end did bring it to life for me. This play came to life for me in a way that I was not expecting at all. And I don't mean that what I directed was very interesting. I mean, I think they did beautiful work. Mm-hmm. It went off without a hitch. It went well. But I think that the real teaching for me inside of it was how much I realized there was to work with in many, many, many different directions. And that actually has woken up an appetite in me to look at many other works with a little bit less bias against them. Mm-hmm. Actually try to look at them for the way that they hit my body, my conditioned, cultured, mind, and whatever it is that we are kind of under construction, but in relationship to our what we encounter. And I think that having a greater artistic appetite after working on something is one of the best outcomes possible, personally.
Oh my God, congrats.
Yeah.
Wow.
So I don't know that it was a successful art piece for anyone else.
But that's success for you.
But for me,
yeah, your journey.
I can feel that there are doors open because I am questioning some of my own rigidity.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I mean, I guess it's an interesting problem as viewpoints practitioners, people that have kind of taken it on as like a big chunk of their life, is to the wholesale kind of rejection of the hierarchy that came before us. Yes, and it's like a yes and, because we wouldn't exist without it. So it is like a really good question of, like, as an educator, thinking about, like, how do we teach the canon? We can't not, in a certain way, teach it. We can't. I mean, it would be a huge disservice to not say, like, Martha Graham existed and here's what she did. But I think it's maybe also about, you know, not continuing to say that this is it. This is the best kind of dance or the best kind of theater, and that we should all be aspiring, you know, like novelists, I think, you know, have this aspiration to be like the next great American novelist, right? You know, like after all the amazing whatever. But it's kind of a, like, as a goal, it can create, as we've talked about before, like a lot of exclusion, and a lot of like, oh, well, in dance, for instance, like, well, you don't have the right size legs, so you'll never be able to do this, so sorry. But if we teach the canon as also something that just sort of happened, and that we can take a step back from it and like look at it, and maybe we grapple inside of it to understand how it feels in the body. I think there are some folks doing like interesting archival work where they put on, I'm sure actors or like people that have done these plays over and over again would be great people to talk to, of like, how does a Chekhov play land on you as opposed to a contemporary play, right? Like what, and if you're doing it over and over and over again, and you have the tools to kind of compare and contrast, like the psychological difference or whatever, would be, or like doing like a Richard Foreman show as opposed to a Chekhov play, like what does that feel like from the inside? Just as I think like dancers are doing that kind of work. Like I think that's my career, is that I was like experimenting with different ways of being in a dance, or using my body in a dance, or not using it, but moving it, doing it, right? You know, I don't know. There's like, I think that by not rejecting it, we can also open the door to being with it critically in a way that could be really useful.
Exactly. Something that you're reminding me is that this process where my approach started to become less, less like of a rebellious teen having to put on her school uniform or something, and became more dynamic, is when I started doing historical research. And the research that I was doing of like what was happening in this moment of time, or the 100 years before that led to the development of this play, I thought that I was doing that work in order to direct the play better. But actually, I mean, and I do think it was essential, but really what it gave me was an understanding of this as happening as something in the context of a million other things. And the conditions at play, the specific, intersections of industrialism and colonialism and classicism and the fall of Tsarism and the emancipation of women and Nietzsche proclaiming God is dead, and that from seeing all of those things, it placed me in 2024 in a moment that was entirely related. Not so far. All of these things that feel, because I think partially because of the dust that praise lays on something, that this like unquestioned praise of the canon can lay on something, in my perception at least, separates it for me from my current moment. But doing that historical context like dissolved this separation. It's like, oh, I'm just tumbling through the same world that these people inside of this play were tumbling forward in, and I just happen to be a few years later.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's really interesting. And I'll just mention really briefly, because when Sophia brought this up, I was like, oh, I just read this like chapter of this book by Jose Luis Reynoso. What's the name of the book? Somebody say it out there. I know you know it. Anybody reading books about dance? Dancing Mestizo Modernisms, which was just published this year. Jose Luis Reynoso teaches at UC Riverside. He's from Mexico. But he's really analyzing how dance in Mexico City had its own version of modernism. Just thinking about all the canons, those personal canons, and also local regional canons that are also dealing with different versions of colonialism, racism, transnational exchange that are creating something different. And yet we still end up with these hyper-modern, or hyper-European modern kind of canons that keep getting called masterpieces. But actually the dusting off of them and the complexifying of them and the living through them, I think it really is like a necessary step to understanding them and understanding what benefit they can still have. It's like great books, right? Mm-hmm. If you haven't read, I don't know, Charles Dickens or something, you're like, oh, that dusty old thing. But until you crack it open and read it and live through it, you don't know why or how it functions. And maybe it's not that different than the things that we have to grapple with now. Mm-hmm. It's just different because it's a different time. And I don't know, I found it really fun to, I was given a nice challenge this year to teach modern dance, which, when I got the email, I like almost died. I was like, oh my God, I was telling Youlim about this like the day before I went to go teach at the university. I was like, Youlim, what am I going to do? I just bashed modern dance like on 3 of our podcasts. Full on, and now I have to go and teach it. Like, what have I done? How am I going to live this double life? And then I was like, well, maybe it doesn't have to be a double life, right? Maybe I can look at modern dance critically and be like, what is the purpose of like returning to these ways of moving? And that's what we looked at. We tried to analyze like why Graham contracted and released, and why you might choose to still do that today, and why Jose Limon fell and got back up. Mm-hmm. Who still does that? Ballroom dancers still do this, right? Mm-hmm. So these themes they go on and on and on, and they just change based on the situation that we're in. And I was like, okay, well, you don't have to do any Graham movements or Limon movements in the pieces that you make at the end of the semester. You can, but you don't have to. I'd rather you find your own way of moving that connects you to something about your experience of life. Mm-hmm. So it was great to also go through that, because it made me realize, again, like, I also have this little snobbiness, I think. Sorry, you might not be snobby, right? We can call it snobbiness, right?
Let's judge our judgment and call it snobbiness.
You call it snobbiness against, like, these things that I just feel like, yeah, okay, I've seen it a million times. It's boring to me, right? We can talk about boredom in the next episode. But if we actually get to go inside of it and experience it, and that reading about it, doing historical research about it, and not just taking it as like, you've done the thing with your leg wrong or right, and that's all I'm going to tell you. Well, that's not very fair, is it? Because we don't get to, like, understand why we're even doing it.
Yeah.
Right?
It's really interesting. This conversation reminds me of our other episode. I think the very first one or second one, we talked about postmodernism philosophy is everything is equal, everything is important. So in other words, modern dance, modern theaters are equally important as postmodernism dance and theater. And it seems like you guys went through.
We had to actually go through it. Yeah, we were both tossed into the past, basically. For the better, maybe.
Yeah, and I think
beautiful.
had to reckon with exactly what you're saying. Reckon with the, like, can I really look at the value of something as I say I do? Like, okay, walk the walk then, my friend. Give it a chance. Pay attention.
Yeah. All right, I think that's our episode for this
Episode
era.
number 10.
We're moving into our double digits now.
Happy New Year,
Thank you so much for
everyone.
listening. Happy New Year, and we will catch you later.
Yeah.
Bye.
If you like this episode, please don't forget to like and subscribe to this channel. Bye!